Hello friends, welcome to Houseplant Tips and Tricks. My name is Nick and today I'm going to give you some tips on caring for Hoyas. This series is sponsored by Repotme.com. Get all of your indoor gardening supplies delivered to your door from one place. Repotme.com has practically anything you need for your orchids, succulents, and houseplants, including handmade potting mixes, planters, fertilizers, and much more. Hoyas are kind of like the Pokemon of the plant world, where once you start collecting them, you're literally going to want to collect every single variety that's out there. And every time you're at a houseplant store and see a new variety that you don't have, it's going to be really difficult not to bring it home. And just like Pokemon, they're always coming out with new ones, which always keeps things spicy, especially in today's plant market when plants are becoming more accessible and lower in price. When Hoyas at the beginning of the pandemic were really picking up in popularity and their prices were skyrocketing, but fortunately it seems like it's really coming down to a low point. That being said, you have to make sure that you're caring for your Hoyas correctly for them to grow to their fullest potential, or they might just be sitting stagnant for a couple of years, which is something I experienced, and I was just blaming it on the Hoyas. I thought that the Hoyas are just really slow growing houseplants, but it was 1000% my own fault, and I'm going to share with you a bunch of tips today, so hopefully you can fast track your Hoyas so that they're not sitting stagnant for a couple of years, and they're growing lush and beautiful just like all the ones on my table are currently. And as you can probably see with the plants I have on the table, there's a lot of visual variety when it comes to Hoyas, and that's what keeps it so exciting, at least to me. While they all do have that characteristic Hoya leaf shape that you're gonna see with many of the more common varieties, there's so many smaller attributes about all of these plants that really sets them all apart from one another. Some might be more about the venation, others might be more about the speckling, some might have larger leaves, some might have smaller leaves, some might have pointed leaves, some might have rounder leaves. There's just, I could keep going, but there's so many characteristics that these plants have. It's just, Hoyas are just so exciting houseplants. So let's talk about how to accurately care for them. Definitely one of the most important things to keep in mind when growing Hoyas is the potting medium that you're growing them in. I grow my Hoyas in such a vast variety of potting mediums, and I find such good success with all of them. Some I'm growing in just plain soil, what you would expect most plants to be growing in, while others I'm growing in sphagnum moss, like this one right here, which is typically something you use to like propagate plants or perhaps grow orchids in. Others I'm growing in what we call semi-hydro or passive hydro, like this one right here, which is actually just sitting inside water, growing inside some clay pebbles. I do go more in depth on this stuff in some of my other videos I have here on my Houseplant Tips and Tricks series, like semi-hydro or passive hydro. We did a whole video where I repotted this Hoya and some other houseplants into semi-hydro, and I have another video where I talk about repotting Hoyas, where I show you the exact mix that I like to use in my home. In fact, Repotme.com does offer a Hoya mix ready to go on their website, which I will also leave in my description below linked. If you click through any of the links that I have in the description of this video and you make any purchases, I will earn a commission, so thank you very much in advance. And you can also use code NICK to save 10% on any potting mix on repotme.com to save yourself some money. But if you do go check out that repotting a Hoya video here on Houseplant Tips and Tricks that I've done, you will see that I'm not using just regular houseplant soil straight from the bag when I'm repotting my Hoyas. It's really important to add some amendments to the soil that is going to gear towards Hoyas and how they want to grow, give their epiphytic roots something to grab onto because that's what they like in nature. So I'll always go ahead and add a good amount of perlite or pumice into a standard houseplant soil when I'm repotting Hoyas, as well as a good amount of bark, and sometimes I'll throw in some charcoal as well just to keep things cleaner, but I think the perlite or pumice and the bark is the most important things to add. That'll keep the soil well aerated and keep it nice and coarse, which, like I said, the roots love having things to grab onto. So you're gonna find a worlds of a difference if you're growing your Hoyas in a much more coarse soil compared to a more loamy soil. When I'm growing my Hoyas in semi-hydro or in sphagnum moss, I am not amending that whatsoever. I am just using LECA pebbles straight from the bag, rinsed of course, or sphagnum moss straight from the bag, planted directly into a planter, typically a glazed ceramic planter in that case. Otherwise that terracotta or unglazed ceramic is going to suck that moisture out of that sphagnum moss much quicker than you would like. You're going to be watering your plants way too often. Sphagnum moss already dries quicker than standard soil mixtures do, and putting it with the glazed ceramics is just not going to be the best thing. So definitely hot tip if you are using sphagnum moss, definitely use a glazed ceramic planter, or a plastic planter is fine. I don't really see them that much anymore, but I would avoid ever planting something inside a metal planter. I'm sure rusting could be an issue too, but that's not my concern. It's more about the temperature. If it's sitting in the hot sun or if it's a cold winter day, that metal is going to really hold on to that temperature and could fry your plant or freeze your plant, and that is no good. So stick with ceramic or plastic if that's more your vibe. Speaking of drying out too fast, That's kind of an issue that I have really just recently learned about my Hoyas. They need to be watered more often than you think. You see these super succulent houseplants and you think that's just like a cactus or a succulent and it needs to dry out in between waterings to grow to its fullest potential. That is definitely why I personally have had such stagnance. Is that a word? My Hoyas have been just doing nothing for me. Is stagnance a word? I like it. If it isn't, it should be, but it probably is. I was not an honors English student growing up. Anyway, my Hoyas were just sitting so stagnant for years, and it was 1000% my own fault because I wasn't watering them enough. I thought that they were fine. This one right here, my Hoya Khao Yai, is a prime example. I had this sitting up in an east-facing window in my old apartment. Fantastic light, the same exact light exposure that it was receiving right now. But the way I had it hanging, it's very specific. I had it hanging up with like a metal orchid hanger, so there was no tray underneath it, which means I had to take it somewhere to water or else the water would just come pouring out into whatever's below it. So because of that, I did not water it nearly enough because I'd have to physically move it away from its spot. Therefore, it just did not grow for me and I was really kind of confused. I thought it was just a super slow growing Hoya, albeit it's not even a really common Hoya, so I just wasn't able to do much research about it. So I just let it be until I moved to this apartment and I've been watering it like every 5 days. Like I said, in the same exact light, where prior I was probably watering it like every 2 to 3 weeks. Not gonna lie there, but now it's shooting off all this new growth. We have at least 5 or 6 tendrils coming in. All these lighter green leaves that you see are brand new in the last couple of weeks, especially the ones that are a little bit more purple or even newer. And of course, I just mentioned how the unglazed ceramic is going to dry out much quicker than the glazed ceramic. So this plant right here in the terracotta, I'm watering 5 days a week, like I said, and that's perfectly fine. But this one over here inside this glazed ceramic planter, that might be a little too moist. You're still going to experience overwatering issues with Hoyas. Just because you have to water them more often doesn't mean that you want them to stay wet. You still do want them to dry out roughly 50% of the way if you're working with a soil mixture. The sphagnum moss, I do go ahead and water once it's just slightly moist or right when it dries. I do not like that to sit dry for long because the roots are sensitive on Hoyas. That's what I'm learning about drying out. That's the issue with them sitting too dry for too long, is that the roots do not come back from that too well. So especially with the sphagnum moss, you want to keep it on the moist side. The semi-hydro plants, you don't need to necessarily worry about as much because they're just gonna keep water inside the reservoir and they're gonna take care of themselves. You wanna keep the water to probably be at least 1/2 inch to 1 inch in contact with your net pot or your LECA pebbles, but if the roots are starting to come out the bottom like this one, it's less of an issue if the roots are at least in the water because they will still be sucking up moisture into the plant. But of course, you want to keep the LECA pebbles moist. Like I said, I talk way more about this in my semi-hydro and passive hydro video. But if you get anything out of today's video, I think really one of the most important things to keep in mind is if your Hoyas are like what mine used to be and they're just sitting doing nothing for what seems like too long, consider watering them more often. It's probably an issue below the roots that you're not seeing, and that's why there's issues above the roots going on. We also really have to keep in mind the lighting conditions that we're giving our Hoyas. That's something I struggled with in the past too, but fortunately I always learn from my mistakes. That's my best quality. A lot of these Hoyas that were just sitting doing nothing for me, I was keeping sitting underneath just crappy grow lights that really weren't doing anything other than just illuminating my plant for me to see inside whatever unlit shelf I was stuffing them in, which is just so not it for Hoyas. I've noticed such a difference when I'm growing my Hoyas in a naturally lit windowsill. Granted, there are good grow lights out there. That's absolutely a step up from the crappy grow lights that I'm talking about, but natural sunlight really seems to be key for getting your Hoyas to grow to their fullest potential, especially the ones that can get sun stressing, like my Hoya macrophylla right here. You can see some of the leaves, particularly if I turn it around this side, have some really nice like red tinging to them. It really does look fantastic, and you're gonna get a lot more of this in some more bright, direct sunlight. And of course, with good light, that's where you're gonna get a bunch of new growth on your plants, and you're gonna get larger leaves. They're not gonna come in smaller, they're gonna continuously come in larger and larger, especially if it's a variety like macrophylla that will grow larger and larger leaves for you as it grows happier and happier, especially if you hit that sweet spot of keeping your plants in really, really good light combined with watering them the perfect amount and keeping those roots nice and satiated. Another way to encourage growth in your Hoyas is, of course, to fertilize them. I fertilize my Hoyas in a couple different methods. I do use just standard houseplant like pellet slow release fertilizer that I will put into the soil to just naturally work when I go ahead and water the plant. Of course, you always want to cut whatever the recommended amount on your fertilizer is in half. I don't know why we don't just mark them halfway down to begin with, but everyone always suggests to do half. It's what I've always heard since the beginning of gardening, so I'm gonna suggest that to you. And it seems to work perfectly fine. Another way to go about fertilizing your Hoyas that I actually learned about from you guys, my audience, is to use an orchid fertilizer mist on your Hoyas. I use the Feed Me plant mist from repotme.com. I've been using it for over a year now, and I really do enjoy it. More so, my Hoyas seem to enjoy it. You simply just spray the leaves. Shouldn't really be doing this over my wood table, but just simply a couple spritz on each of them. Make sure that you hit the leaves and you hit the stems where all that new growth will be coming out. And that's really all you need to do. Do it like every 2 weeks or so in the growing season. Don't really need to worry about it in the winter months. Fertilizing in general, you do not need to worry about in the winter months. So like April to October, maybe if you want to do just the tiniest little bit in November, just in case if your Hoyas are still actively growing, no problems there. But they're not actively growing in the winter months, so there's no need to give them fertilizer, and it's best to wait until the spring months to give them that little extra boost that they're going to need. Another thing that I think is really important to keep in mind when growing Hoyas is the pot size. You can probably see very clearly here that I have none of these sitting in large containers. Most of them are on the smaller side, which is good for you as a plant collector. Smaller pots means you can keep more plants in your home. Hello. But these plants do like to stay really tight, and their roots are not fast growers. And I feel more than likely, if you are purchasing a Hoya at your local houseplant stores, if you go ahead and take it out of that container, like as soon as you bring it home, there's probably not going to be that much roots in there. Like it's not going to be a root-bound plant like the way you're going to find like a pothos or a spider plant at your local houseplant stores would be. So that being said, I would recommend letting them sit in whatever container you purchase them in for like a month or 2 or 3. I mean, I usually let them sit for like a good 3 to 6 months in their container, unless it's a change I'm making, like if I'm moving them to semi-hydro, or if maybe the plant is struggling a little bit and I think I want to move it to Sphagnum Moss. But 9 times out of 10, I would say I'm leaving my Hoyas inside the container I got them in for at least a full month. And then from there, I'm finding a container that's just a little bit bigger, like no more than an inch in diameter larger, which is pretty standard for smaller houseplants. But even if you're working with like a 6-inch pot of Hoya, I would keep it in the 7-inch planter. I wouldn't go any bigger than that. I think even if you put in an 8-inch planter, if it's too much room below or on the side, if there's not that many roots, that's when you can stumble across issues. So patience is key. I'm a very patient person, so that doesn't really bother me myself, but just find a nice planter that fits inside nicely. I cannot tell you how often I would get a shipment of Hoyas in when I worked at the plant store, and they would look so gorgeous when I took them out of the box, and they would look amazing for like a week, and then after a week, those leaves, the new leaves that were on the plant, would all just turn yellow and fall off. And if you repotted those plants before that, I feel like that shock that they're experiencing from probably just not having like the most roots, as I was saying, is going to be experienced tenfold. And I do not want you to waste money. Although, like I said, Hoyas are becoming much more affordable. I was just at a houseplant store the other day and I was amazed at the variety of Hoyas that they had and the prices that they were at. It was tempting not to bring a bunch of them home because they had varieties I don't have. Like I said, it's tough. But I talked myself through it, and here we are, and I still have the Hoyas that I just love and care for in my home, and they're fantastic and they're gorgeous. Which is not a tip that I really have to share for you today, but love your plants, love and appreciate them for what they are, and remember what you have at home. And before, not having to do with this video, but hot tip definitely, before you bring home a plant, make sure you know where you're gonna put it, or at least that you have a spot for it, because I've been guilty of that many, 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 many times. That might have been a mistake that I didn't learn from immediately, but I've learned from it now. But yeah, keep your container on the smaller side when you are potting your plants up. If your nursery planter just fits inside that planter with just a little bit of extra room, that's smooth sailing. And if you're working with terracotta, like I said, it's going to dry out, I've said it 6,000 times now, but it's going to dry out quicker. So you can maybe go like that extra ½ inch larger when it comes to terracotta, versus if you're working with the glazed ceramic, you might want to really keep that on the smaller side. And last but not least, I guess this care tip is like remotely optional compared to all the other ones that I've talked about, but you can see on my 2 larger plants that I have on screen today, my Hoya macrophylla, my Hoya Khao Yai, that they do have a piece of bamboo inside them. This is a bamboo hoop that I'm using right here. You can use bamboo sticks. I know repotme.com has bamboo sticks that you can turn into like a teepee shape. I've done that for my Hoya macrophylla in the past before I actually just recently repotted it in the last month or so. But the reason that we give them the bamboo stake, or any other small thin stake is perfectly fine, is because these tendrils love to explore. You can see on this one, that these tendrils are starting to wrap around the bamboo here. This one I had to like force it on because I had it on the bamboo teepee in the past, so it's just kind of stuck to it. They haven't naturally grown onto it yet, but this one is really starting to naturally work its way around. They look for the bamboo and they start to circle their way around. You can see with this one right here, the way it's really started to wrap its way around, and they're going to continuously grow like this. And once they have something to grab onto, maybe this is just my own experience, but that's when they really take off. They know they have support, something to grab onto, and they just explode with new growth. And I know I said it's remotely optional, but I would highly recommend it. I had a Hoya Australis that I had in my past home. I still have it, and it's taking over my 2 bamboo hoops at this point. I really need to do something about it, but it was grabbing onto everything I could find in the window that I was growing it in. It was grabbing onto like pieces of jute rope that were hanging down from plant propagations. And I swear, if I did not take care of that thing when I did, it was gonna rip something out of the ceiling. So maybe that's more to me, but in my experience, these things are going to really take off once they start growing and find something to grab onto. So it's best to give them a support early so they can really just take over this support, and it gives them something to grow onto. You're not gonna have to possibly break leaves and vines as you're untwining it from whatever it's stuck itself onto. So once they get going, this one over here in the corner, I know it's kind of off screen, but it's got some tendrils that are really starting to go everywhere. In fact, some of them I can see, oh God, so many plants. But this one's all wrapping around itself and grabbing onto itself. So if I gave this a bamboo hoop, this thing would be very happy. I just kind of like the way that it looks when it's trailing right now, which is why I understand why I said it's optional, because plants, we grow plants, you know, for many different reasons, but one of them is for the aesthetic of our home. And if you're not into the bamboo hoop, I'm not gonna knock you on that, but maybe find something else. I'm sure there's even a bunch of small business owners and artists online who probably make their own types of Hoya trellises for you to try in your home and give you some fun, unique character for your plants. But besides that, that's really all the tips I have on how to care for your Hoyas. I hope that you have learned quicker than I have with Hoyas, but if not, that is literally what I am here for today, and hopefully all of the many mistakes that I was making with my Hoyas in the past, you're gonna nip that in the bud today, and we're right at the beginning of the growing season right now, so it's the perfect time for your Hoyas to just get that kick in the butt that they need to grow to their fullest potential. Like I said, I think the most important thing that I've learned in the last couple of years with my Hoyas is the watering them more often than I think. These look like succulent plants. We think that they're gonna be treated like cacti, but that's just not the case. So anything out of this video, water your Hoyas more often. And I'm not an expert, clearly, from all the mistakes that I've made, so there are many more tips that are perfect for Hoyas out there. If you have any tips of your own, please leave them in the comments below and share them with others. I would really appreciate it. Obviously, I need them, but help others out as well. I would love to hear your hot tips. But thank you guys so much for joining me today. Like I said, I'm gonna leave any of the products that I talked about linked in my description below. I'll also leave those 2 videos that I talked about, the repotting Hoya and passive or semi-hydro tutorial, linked in my description below as well if you want to check those videos out. And don't forget, you can use code NICK to save 10% on any potting mix on repotme.com. But make sure you click through those links in my description so that you earn me a little commission. Okay, thanks. So thank you again for joining me today. If you don't already, you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at phillyfoliage. You can subscribe to my Patreon if you would like, just to support me monetarily. There's really nothing else on there and anymore. And subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already, please. I appreciate it. And I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day.